Hello, and welcome to Aging Matters, a program featuring timely topics for older adults and their families. I'm Cheryl Beversdorf, your host. When caring for a loved one with dementia, a caregiver may feel like reality rules have been altered, and guidance is needed to help handle the shifting symptoms of this diagnosis. What is often useful are practical suggestions and interventions that can help both the caregiver and the person with dementia navigate this challenging and demanding time. My guest today is Barbara Huelat, a healing design strategist and author of a book called Taming the Chaos of Dementia. She's going to talk about the need for caregivers of persons with dementia to be knowledgeable about disease symptoms and educated about caregiving interventions. She'll also explain changing dementia behaviors and how these recommendations can support the journey of both the caregiver and the person with dementia. So welcome, Barbara, and thank you for joining me today.
Yes, good morning, and thank you so much, Cheryl, for having me.
We're glad to have you here and to prepare our listeners for what we're going to be talking about today. Give us a bit of an overview. Explain to us what dementia is, what the symptoms are that occur in each of the phases of the disease, and maybe you can even move a little bit forward and talk about how the care needs differ for the various types of dementia.
Well, dementia is really a complex symptom. It's not really a disease itself. It is kind of an umbrella term for many cognitive disorders, including the largest disease, which is Alzheimer's, but also other forms of dementia like Parkinson's and vascular dementia. But they all have one thing in common, is that it affects the cognitive memory. And cognitive memory is what governs us to how we act, what our behaviors are, how we think, what we know, what we don't know. And all dementias have this cognitive memory issue. And it's really probably most important to understand that it's the memory impairment. But there's two memories that we have as humans. One is the semantic memory, which is all about our cognitive data that we've accumulated over our lifetime, our language skills, our math skills, the ability to know where we are, how to tell time. It's also an important element for our behaviors and how we filter our behaviors. So our filters are broken with dementia in that we don't know how to behave appropriately. That's gone. We learn not to say certain things. We are careful about how we treat people with our normal memory. But with dementia, that's gone. But the bright thing about dementia and the memory is that our empathetic memory, which is our emotional memory, is still intact. And most of the time, it's mostly intact to the very end. So knowing that gives us the ability to interact with people with dementia and work with their empathetic or emotional memory rather than their cognitive memory. That's basically how dementia works, regardless. And there's some variations between Alzheimer's, for example, which is has a lot of movement disorders and sometimes more prone to hallucinations. But knowing what type of dementia, what the root disease is very important in understanding how to interact with our loved ones with dementia. I believe you also asked about the phases of dementia. There are three basic phases of any of the dementia diseases, and that's early, middle, and late. And depending on which type of dementia, for example, Lewy bodies in Alzheimer's is very similar, other than Lewy bodies comes on very strong at the beginning. So you may all of a sudden feel like you're in mid-stage dementia when you've just been diagnosed. But typically with dementias, they can last a long period of time. You can be sometimes 20 years with the disease from the time it's diagnosed. So there are different symptoms that you see in the different phases. So in the early phase of disease, you may just forget things. You may forget an appointment. You may forget people's names. And then as the disease progresses, you lose more of those cognitive memories. And by the late stages of dementia, you are typically bedridden, incontinent, and then unable to speak. So there are the three distinct phases of dementia that each of the diseases has.
And I would imagine then that given the different types of symptoms in each of the phases, the care would not only be different for each of those phases, but then also for the different types of dementia that you're describing, since the symptoms seem to vary depending on the type of dementia that a person has. Am I correct?
Yes, especially in the early phase. This is the phase that there's the most discrepancy between the different types of dementia. And this is also the phase where medications for dementia may help. Many of the dementias, you can still live independently, often even drive a car, but you may have a harder time with directions. So it is starting to impact the cognitive ability, and maybe you can't balance the checkbook anymore, or maybe you forget to take your medications. So it's a slow progress with the diseases. But in that early phase, the different dementias, understanding what type of disease you have is very important, because that will be different for different caregiving needs. By the time you're in the mid stage of dementia, they're pretty much all the same. There may be some variation, like I mentioned with Parkinson's, there's much more possibility for hallucinations, but hallucinations will occur in any dementia. So by the mid stage, they're pretty much all the same.
Let's turn to the caregiving interventions, since that's what your book is about. Tell us, what are caring interventions? What exactly does that mean, and why they're necessary? And then we'll move on a little bit in terms of just what it's like to be a caregiver. But explain first what that is.
We think of interventions like surgical interventions or pharmaceutical interventions. But in the case of dementia, you are dealing with behavior, emotion, memories, cognition. So the interventions that we have available to us, there's not surgery available. Medications are very unreliable at this time, and again, pretty much limited to the early phases of dementia. That may hold off the diseases, the implication of the diseases. But interventions that you can do, the environmental interventions, the social interventions, these are things that really are helpful. And when we gear these interventions to the emotional side of our memories, they can be very effective. You can even engage in conversation with someone that's lost the ability to speak. So the interventions that we have that I talk about in my book are very much interventions that you, the caregiver, can control. And they're very, very helpful. And they are helpful in two ways. They help with safety issues. You help keep your loved one safe and avoid risk, but they are very, very helpful for the emotional side, because this is where most caregivers have the biggest problem in dealing with meltdowns or disruptive behaviors. So this is where the interventions that we'll talk about are very, very helpful. I know for myself, this was the big learning curve I had when I was a caregiver. My mom had Parkinson's, my grandmother had vascular dementia, my father-in-law had Alzheimer's, and my late husband had Alzheimer's. And although there are subtleties with the differences, the big thing I learned in caregiving is dealing with the emotional interventions that are so helpful in finding the joy of living with your loved ones with this cognitive impairment.
And before we get into building the caregiving team, talk a little bit more about the health risks for caregivers. Why is it really important that they care for themselves first, physically and mentally, and that they are educated about what they need to do and what they'll need to be facing?
The risk for caregivers is extremely high. It is said that caregiving for dementia is you have two patients, the person with the disease and the caregiving burden of stress, which is extremely high. My doctor told me that it was equivalent to smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. And so the health risk for caregivers is real and it's serious. And the reason why it is serious is because caregiving stress is a chronic stress. And there's 2 kinds of stress. As you may know, we have the stress that's good for us, like the fight or flight type of stress. You see the tiger, you run, and your adrenaline goes up, and you deal with the stress. The tiger goes away, and your body goes back to its normal function. But with chronic stress, that tiger is ever present. It never goes away. It never goes to sleep. So you, as a caregiver, are always taking care of this person. Even when you're at rest and sleeping, you're worrying about how to take care of your loved one with whatever you're dealing with that day. And you may have had a terrible day. You may have terrible experiences, which increases your stress and leads to health risk. I know in caregiving for my late husband, I ended up with a heart attack in the hospital. And I remember the night I was admitted, I'm laying on the gurney in the ED, and I'm worrying about, I left Joe, my husband, at home alone, and he has dementia. And I wasn't so much concerned about my own, I have a heart attack, will I make it? But I'm still worrying about taking care of him. And this is the kind of stress that caregivers deal with. The worry never turns off. Even when your person is in a caregiving home or a memory care facility, that worry is constant. So you have to be able to take care of your own needs first. And that's really hard to do because you don't recognize it. It slowly creeps in. First, it's, I have to now take over the checkbook, or I now have to pay the mortgage payment. He used to do that. Now I have to do it. Start slowly. Oh, he forgot about the invitation we had. But then it gets more and more, and he gets lost, and he wanders away, and all kinds of issues start to build up, and the worry from the caregiver never goes away.
So, Barbara, noting how much of a burden caregiving can be for a person with the dementia, talk about why it's important for caregivers to build a caregiving team.
Well, a caregiving team allows a distribution of the burden, and you can have caregiver teams that will help around the house, but mostly to get you out and away from your day-to-day stress of taking care of your loved one. Giving you a time to take a walk, to get outside, to do something you like, have lunch with a friend, call some family members. When I was a caregiver, this realization that people wanted to help was really immense for me and very, very helpful. And not only in allowing me some time off, but also somebody else to interact with my loved one. And it took some of that stress. But every time you had a caregiver, another caregiver, and I had a couple from the VA helped. I had family that would come in. You'd have to give a whole set of instructions. So what I thought was really, really helpful was to create a notebook. And in that notebook, I had things that my loved one liked to eat or didn't like to eat. My mom was a tea drinker. She would refuse coffee and sometimes throw it on the floor if somebody gave it to her by mistake. Joe loved ice cream, and all these things were in the notebook, as well as things like doctors and emergency numbers and my contact number, what time he should take his medication, things like that. So practical things as well as personal things. It made the caregiver's job a lot easier. And I was more reassured that he was happy and engaged in some kind of activities. My neighbor took Joe for walks, wonderful things, and it helped immensely with my burden.
The other thing that was very interesting in terms of the caregiving team, is you mentioned in your book about it was a term called a sense of place. Explain what that means. I noted that there was a concept of home and work life and community for a person with dementia. What does that mean?
This is pretty interesting. It came from a social biologist at the University of Florida. And he talked about there's 3 places we need for human fulfillment: a place of home, a place of work, and a place of play. And having access to all those 3 areas are important for all of us to thrive and to feel balanced. When we don't have them, if our life all centers around work, for example, we get burnout. Same thing with all home. If we're stuck in the home for everything, we don't have the access to play and to empowerment. So this was something I learned while I was designing senior living facilities and needing to have destinations besides your bedroom and the dining room. So creating a sense of play meant that we needed to have a place where the person with dementia can enjoy life, play games or do a craft. The sense of work was they needed to feel worthwhile. They needed to be engaged in either folding laundry, setting the table. So finding ways, a sense of place that is specific to those 3 main areas of life helps keep the person with dementia very much engaged in their life. And when you do, they participate more in communication. Their symptoms are more manageable. They feel more happy. They feel more empowered. They feel good about life. So those 3 places are really important that you create them in whatever environment they're living in.
Another aspect that you talked about, which would of course be outside the home as well, and that's traveling. And you mentioned a number of factors to consider when traveling with a person with dementia. What do we need to know?
Traveling can be a relief for both the caregiver and the person with dementia. But it is most successful when the person is used to traveling, when they go to familiar places or there's some familiarity with places, that you don't over-plan trips. So it might be nice to go visit an adult child or a son or daughter or a friend, family member can be a lot of fun. But you need to keep their needs, especially their cognitive needs, in mind, what they can and can't do. They may not understand an airplane. They may no longer understand the need to wait in line. They may not understand that they're bored with a situation, like they may be in a restaurant and you've kept them too long and they become agitated and want to leave immediately. So I think to engage in travel and restaurants and other outside the home activities, you do need to plan. I know what a really wonderful little tool that has come up by Dementia Friendly America, which is an organization across the country that helps create awareness of what dementia is. They produce these like little business cards, and it says on the card, please understand my loved one is suffering from dementia. With that, you can give that to the a waiter in the restaurant, and they help seat you away from a crowded area or near a window. And using those little cards are very, very helpful. And it makes other people understand and help you get through what could be a very difficult situation. And then, remove distractions. Move that container of sugar packages and ketchup and mustard away, because it will end up being a distraction and a toy that they may end up in the water glass or on the floor. So be mindful and lower your expectations. No, it's not going to be the same as it was before, but it can be a great relief for both you and your loved one.
I wanted to just have you talk a little bit about trigger factors. You mentioned those, and explain to us, our listeners, what are trigger factors and what are ways to manage them?
Trigger factors are probably the biggest problematic issue that caregivers deal with. Almost all disruptive behaviors that people with dementia exhibit are caused by some trigger factors. And they seem to fall into three categories. And one is a social category, one is an environmental category, and the third is a medical category. So triggers are something that the person with dementia cannot deal with. It's a issue in their environment or conversation that bothers them, and their filters are gone, so they don't know how to react. And when they don't know how to react to an outside trigger, it almost always involves disruptive behavior of some type. Each person with dementia will tend to go to same types of responses. It may be they get up and leave. They may throw something. They may use awful language. But it is difficult to deal with. They may just have a meltdown and cry and scream and you want to avoid those trigger factors. I mean, nobody likes working through them. So anything you can do to avoid the trigger will help with reducing the symptoms. These three categories, I want to mention them because they're things that they fit into them. And I often kept a notebook of what the triggers were to avoid them in the future. So, for example, medical triggers are something they may not have eaten when they took their medicine and their stomach is upset. Medical triggers are hard to understand and find. So you can't do a whole lot of things in the medical area other than be attentive. My mom suffered from UTIs, and when she started acting a certain way, I suspected it might be that, and it usually was. But medical triggers are often hard to diagnose yourself. The social ones are really big, and this is, how do you talk to somebody with dementia? And sometimes asking questions or making demands of them does not work. They cannot process the question, typically, and this happens even in the early phases of dementia. You may ask them where their daughter is. They forgot they had a daughter. Oh my gosh, something happened to my daughter. And they start worrying and get anxious. So asking questions is really something we want to avoid. Giving commands is also a very, very much part of the social triggers. Demanding something of a person with dementia is very difficult because they don't understand how to respond. They don't always understand the question or the command. Environmental triggers, which is the easiest to control, well, so is social. Social is very easy to control. But this deals with light, color, temperature, things in our environment that make the person edgy, creates a trigger, and they act inappropriately. A glare, for example, with light. They don't understand what the glare is. What is that weird shape on the wall? It must be a monster. And they get afraid. My grandmother got terrified from a reflection outside a window in the dining room and thought aliens were coming to take them away because she saw these strange shapes, which were just people moving in the building and reflecting on the window. Our rational mind can sort those out. But for people with dementia, these environmental triggers can be devastating and cause very difficult situations.
And Barbara, you talked a lot about what to know and especially what the caregiver needs to know, but we were just beginning to get involved more in how to help the person with dementia. And I'd like to talk more about the concept of home. Why is the concept of home so important to persons with dementia?
This was something that is very difficult for caregivers to understand. It is so common for the person with dementia to say, I want to go home. And the caregiver may say, but you are home. No, I want to go to my home. And they're very, very insistent. I think in all the caregivers I spoke with, this was a common issue. People with dementia are looking for emotions of home and familiarity of home. And we think of home as being a place. But for people with dementia, the home is an experience. It is not a place. They call it home because there's certain feelings they attribute to home. Something that may be warm, comforting, their nest, their bed, their mom, their sister, their brother, their loved ones. A mom may have been gone for 40 years or more, but they're still looking for mom. And part of this is a term called time slips. And time slips is a concept of dementia where persons move from today, 2024, to maybe at 1957. And they're looking for that home. Maybe not the physical home entirely. Maybe they're looking for their back porch of that home. Maybe they're needing to take their children to school. They still believe they have to do that, or they have to pick their husband up from work. All kinds of feelings attached with home of a certain time period. And we, as a caregiver, have no idea where they are or why they don't recognize they're in home. And we keep saying, you are in home. I know I had my mom who refused to go in her door of her home, saying it wasn't her home. It was somebody else's, some stranger's home, that she didn't know who it was and she wasn't going to go. What I did to resolve this is just say, okay, let's go find your home. And I took her back around to the sidewalk, walked around the block, came back and walked in the door, and she was fine. She was back with me. And part of reassuring them is pointing out things that are familiar, walking by her side of her house. Your roses are beautiful today, Mom. Remember when you got them as a Mother's Day present, and start talking about familiarity of when they were home and things that might have been important to them in home. So home is a matter of emotions, and trying to find that connection with home is sometimes difficult. But the good thing is those with dementia live only in the present, and then they move on. So what may have been an issue 5 minutes ago, where is home? I don't know where home is and I want to go home, may be gone. And we know if we start talking about something else, take them on a different route, describing home and walking into the door, they may be very comfortable with that. So use that living in a moment as an intervention to get you out of a tough spot. Because one of the beauties of dementia is they never remember it. They'll move on.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is that you're saying there's quite a difference between the structural concept of home versus the emotional. And you described that very well. And in your book, you also talked about home adjustments that can be made to help persons with dementia. So I would like to hear a little bit more about that, and was also wondering if you could address the idea if at some point the person with dementia may need to move to a care facility. So explain what could be done while a person is still not in a care facility and how that might have to be approached when they actually do go to a care facility?
Sure. The structure of the home is very important. And living in your current home is always more familiar and easier for the person with dementia. But there are problems in our homes with access to our home, safety, especially in the kitchen and bathroom and stairs. These are big risks for those with dementia. The visual acuity is not the same. Their hearing is not the same. And it's not just aging. Dementia adds another level of complexity to all of our senses and how we perceive our environment. So there's glare that it's a problem. One of the biggest problems that we often don't see is clutter. Leaving clutter around not only becomes a tripping hazard, a falling hazard, but it also becomes a source of stuff that we don't necessarily want our loved one to investigate. So removing clutter is one of the things we can do. Keeping familiar things there, but reducing them so they're simple, and maybe they're favorites. Taking away furniture that becomes a tripping hazard, or just moving into furniture. Furniture often becomes an assistance to support us moving around the house. So, example, we may use a table to help us walk, and the table, if it's not sturdy, will tip over and the person goes down. Sometimes getting in and out of chairs becomes a problem. So there are certain things with both the environment of the house that needs to be addressed both emotionally so that you keep that familiarity, but also reduces the risk factor associated with how a person with dementia would use the same thing.
And it sounds like if it would be necessary to move to a care facility, maybe taking some of those furnishings and something that's familiar to that facility, does that help?
Absolutely. One of the things family members think, like their child is going off to school, college, and they're going to buy them all new things. That's the worst thing you want to do. You want to bring the most important things to them, things that they remember and they can associate. If they have a picture of a loved one on a wall that they've commented about, be sure and bring that. Blankets and bedding, pillows. My grandmother, when she had to go into the facility and she was suddenly in a room and she couldn't sleep, and she cried herself to sleep every night. And I brought her pillows from home. That was actually a wedding present for her that she had for years. And she just loved having her pillow and never had a sleep problem after that. So looking for things that are familiar is very, very helpful.
You said art, artifacts, and objects. Other things that complement the furnishings are really what it's all about. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And it's interesting with art, it suddenly becomes a therapeutic tool. Art, especially vintage art and familiar art, will help bring a person around to sometimes converse in ways you haven't heard them talk about before. So art becomes an object. And from art that you put on the wall, it must be familiar. This is not the time you want to add all kinds of new art and new furnishings. Familiarity is key. There was a picture, my father-in-law, when we put him in a facility, there was a picture of a family kitchen. And it was in a hallway, and he always loved this family kitchen. He talked about it being his mother and his family, and it certainly didn't even resemble his family, but to him, it was the experience he was seeing in the picture that made it relatable and familiar. And so in designing memory care facilities, these were the things we looked for. Key of keeping it familiar, and if not exactly familiar, like their own home, something that is familiar in their life.
You mentioned also in your book about the relationship between light and dementia. And you mentioned it a little bit earlier in our conversation. Talk a little bit more about that relationship. What is that, and how can light actually benefit persons with dementia?
There's two things I want to mention about light that are extremely important. One is the functional factor, the piece that we need to avoid risk and falls and confusion. And that's how light behaves. There's certain properties to light and color of light. The second is the emotional connection and the behavioral connection to light. And that has to deal with our biology. And light is extremely important in setting our bio clock, our 24-hour bio clock. Actually, natural sunlight and daylight sets all of our hormones and time we feel hunger, time we feel sleep. And so getting access to natural sunlight is really, really important to keep us healthy. It's important for all of us to keep healthy and to keep our bio clock in rhythm, or called the circadian rhythm. And so getting the person outside, especially the morning sunlight, helps set that bio clock. The science has said we need 2 hours of direct sunlight or outside a week. And it's hard to do for a person with dementia, is actually get them outside. But it really is important. It can make the difference between sundowning, wandering in the middle of the night, sleep patterns, because those hormones are essential for creating our natural sleep cycles. So that's the biological reason we need sunlight. When we don't get it, it often causes triggers. And these triggers, as we talked about before, contribute to unwanted behaviors. So trying to get the person outside is really important to set that bio clock. Functionally, lighting is very, very important. We need 3 times as much lighting. The aging eye needs 3 times as much lighting to see the same thing as a middle-aged person, for example, or a younger person. So seeing is very, very critical. It also helps with delusions and what they're seeing. Also, as we mentioned before, the glare from lighting can be very problematic. So watching what light we use, we need to light heavily task areas like stairs and kitchens and bathrooms at a higher intensity so they see what they're doing. And also to avoid the problems with glare. So lighting is an important consideration.
You also talked about color. You said color can impact the well-being and the quality of life for persons with dementia. So explain why. And in that context also, you talked about something called art making, and that it can be therapeutic. So give us a little overview about that concept.
Color is another kind of amazing fact because it kind of fits into that emotional side of our memories. So color can be very pleasant, but the structure and the chemistry of color is that color is either stimulating or calming or boring, and depending on how color is used. And not to go into a whole discussion on the theory of color, but to know that color is stimulating or is relaxing. And the fact that just because a person has dementia and may not be able to identify that that is red or that is blue, the impact of color that has on the emotion and the brain and the feelings is still present. So colors like black, for example, that we typically associate with night and darkness and sometimes scary things should be avoided. Colors that are bright and stimulating, like reds and oranges, are going to be very stimulating, and you're not going to want them in a bedroom where you want to relax, but might be a great place in the dining room or kitchen. Color should be used as a contrasting tool. So, and help the person with dementia see. So if you put on the table a white table and a white plate and white dishes, they're not going to be able to differentiate the edges of the plate or their food. So by putting a red placemat under the white dish on a white table will help increase that visibility and also be stimulating and attracting. So those little things can make a really big difference in helping your person want to eat, be attracted to food on their plate, and then also not to see things that you don't want to see. So if we have a utility room or something, we want to paint out that door the same color as the walls so we don't encourage them to go in there. We did that with my mom to go down the basement because she always wanted to go in the basement. What's behind that door? She didn't remember what's behind the door. But if the door goes away, she ceases to see it and she no longer wants to go to the basement. So you can do a lot with color to help distract, disguise, or attract places you want them to go or don't want them to go.
And what was the art making? What was that?
Yes, art making is a way to engage. It's an intervention, and it's an emotional intervention. Very, very popular, and now memory care facilities have strong art making programs in their facilities. But also, art making is something you can do at home. One of the most fun that people that were never artistic love to engage in is finger painting. You can't just give them a sheet of paper and crayons and call it art making. There has to be some engagement. It takes time and description and doing it along with them to help them feel good about it and enjoy the art making. Another popular art making is taking little squeeze bottles like ketchup bottles and filling them with paint and drizzling them on a board and creating clay is another one that's very textural. And it's amazing. Art making works on the emotional side of the brain, and it's amazing people start talking when they're engaged in art and reaching levels that we thought was inaccessible to their disease symptoms. So encouraging art making, simple things that they can do. There's now available on the market. There's workbooks that are engaged for various types. Knitting, even though they don't really knit, just handling yarn and baskets of color of yarn feels like it's art making. So it doesn't have to be complex, but can be very enjoyable and open up that cognitive memories.
And another aspect, especially now, given our current focus on technology, you mentioned a lot about new technology, and you gave some examples of how it can help both the persons with dementia and their caregivers. So talk a little bit about that. What kinds of devices might be helpful?
Technology, I am so supportive of for those with dementia. I have a feeling that technology will help us more than any kind of medication for the next few years because technology is growing. And we have technology that is very, very helpful in the functional area and risk management, such as safety. There's safety switches and elements you can buy to convert your stove to be more safe and to shut off if the person leaves it. And then there's all of the smart technology, like with the phone, that has grown into monitoring the GPS tracking system that we use to find your phone can also be used for find your loved one. GPS technology is available with wearable technology that you can put on your clothes, put inserts in your shoes, help find your loved one if they've wandered off, which is quite frequent event. So technology can help us, but it's also fun. I'm very excited about some of the new robotics that are happening in the area of technology. France has developed a little seal that is a cross between a stuffed animal and a character that is animated, the little dogs that bark, and now they're developing robots that can be programmed to dance with the loved one and to engage with them on things that is familiar to them. And it seems that the early studies have shown that the people are very comfortable with these little creatures. They're not afraid of them. They're not as crazy as what we might think. Oh, mom would never like that dancing robot, but mom does, and she'll dance with him. So it's very interesting. Also, VR, virtual reality, is something that's very exciting. There's now programs that will go to nursing homes or even come to your own home and take your loved one on a trip. They can go fishing with VR, or they can get on a gondola in Venice and tour the canals. So I think there's a lot of possibility with technology. And even today, there's very simple things that are available for loved ones that you can find on the internet. Games, the Wii games where you can go bowling or dance, can be very, very invigorating. You don't even have to get up on your feet. You can dance from sitting in a chair, and it can be very motivating and bring smiles to their faces.
And I know you have lots more examples in your book, but I wanted to get to two other examples that I think are interesting too. You use the term biophilia, and I believe that has to do with nature-based interventions. So I'd like to hear more, and I'm sure our listeners would as well, about what that means and why nature is so important.
Well, biophilia is a great intervention. Mother Nature knows. And we react to nature our whole lives. Sometimes we forget about her and put her in the closet and say it's not important. But anything you can do outside is better than inside. The relationship that we have with nature, which is biophilia, it is a relationship that is innate to our humanness, that relates people to nature, and we're part of nature. And we have evolved through nature. So it is very, very natural and feel good to connect with nature. And this can be in many ways. Being outside, of course, is very advantageous, that we talked about with light, but also animals and just seeing animals, watching a squirrel at the bird feeder, naming the squirrel, talking about the squirrel, just seeing the squirrel. Birds are wonderful to watch. Fish have been used in healthcare facilities forever because it connects with nature. Watching them move, swim, having a dog. There are even therapy dogs that are trained specifically as companions for those with dementia. So animals are very important. Windows, seeing windows, having a chair where you can sit and actually sit there for a long time and just look out the window is very, very comforting and engaging. And all kinds of things happen when you connect that emotional part of our biophilic memory to an actual event, even bringing things with you. I know my late husband, when he was in his late middle stages of dementia, he continually picked up rocks. I don't know what they meant to him, but they became a piece of honor. And every time he went outside, he picked up stones, he put them in his pocket. Sometimes he took them home and put them on windowsills or tables. And sometimes talking about it, picking up a pine cone, looking at it together, talking about it, reinforces that deep connection with nature. Gardening, getting your hands in the dirt, is also a great connection with nature.
Well, the final thing I wanted to also mention is, because I thought this was important, was your focus on sensory engagement. And you mentioned about using one or more of the five senses to strengthen connections with persons with dementia. We're almost out of time, but if you could just give a few examples of that.
Sensory engagement is that big link back to the emotional part of our memories, which is very important and makes that connection and helps with interventions. I will mention music therapy as the number one sensory intervention we can use, because there are two things. One, it has the greatest amount of research on it, and it is so effective that even people in their very late phases of dementia where they haven't spoken for months, with music that they're familiar with, they can start talking again. Any one of the senses, and art and color and smells and textures and holding hands and laughter are all wonderful sensory connections, and they can be engaged all day for any phase that your loved one is in with dementia.
And you give quite a few examples of that, again, in your book. Is that correct?
Yes. In the last chapter, chapter 10, is all about the senses and sensual engagement. So, yes, I go into that in a lot of detail.
Any other resources that you wanted to recommend to our listeners that could lessen the challenges of dementia?
Sure. This question comes up quite often. If you go to my website, barbarahuelat.com, B-A-R-B-A-R-A, Huelat, Huelat.com, I have a section on resources. And in that, I list all of the dementia organizations that are helpful for caregivers and lists of sites they can go to. Also, my favorite books, I have about 20 of them listed there. So the resources, the books, the organizations, the help groups, the support groups are all listed there in one place and easy to find.
Any final comment?
Oh, yes. We think of dementia as a horrible disease and we're afraid of it. And we should be. We have no cures for it. So dementia is one of those things we fear most about aging. But there is a joyous side, and it is very possible to live with a person with dementia and find joy. And by using and accessing the emotional side of the brain and trying to set aside the cognitive issues and not going there, working with the disease, understanding the disease can bring a lot of joy to your life with your loved one.
Excellent way to end this fine program. And I really want to thank you, Barbara Huelat, who is a healing design strategist, and she's also the author of a book called Taming the Chaos of Dementia. Thank you so much for joining me today, Barbara.
Thank you, Cheryl. It's been a pleasure.
In case our listeners want to learn more about Aging Matters, you can visit our website, which is agingmattersonline.com. And of course, at this site, you can access all of the Aging Matters radio, the podcast, as well as the TV show episodes, and find any other kind of information about Aging Matters as well there. So be sure and take a look at that website. Aging Matters is produced in association with Steve Flack Audio, and you can learn more about that company at steveflackaudio.com. Thank you for listening to Aging Matters today, and remember, age is just a number, not a label. I'll be back again with you next week.